The moment she carved the name into the snow on his tomb, the vampire king read it aloud from directly behind her. She was Elara, a carver of stone, a woman the world saw as little more than a ghost haunting the edges of other people's grief. He was Lord Alaric Vale, a creature of ice and shadow, a king ruling a silent, frozen kingdom of memory. The world had dismissed her for being too quiet, too morbid, too plain. He had dismissed the world for being too loud, too fleeting, too warm. No one should have noticed her, least of all him. But what no one knew was that her simple, compassionate act was the first touch of warmth his frozen heart had felt in 300 years. If you believe that being truly seen by one person can change a soul the rest of the world has forgotten, type remembered below, and let me tell you what happened next. To understand how she got there, you need to know that Elara's hands were more comfortable with a mallet and chisel than they were with a teacup or a needle. She spoke the language of granite and marble, a silent tongue that translated sorrow into permanence. She was a monumental mason, a trade that belonged to burly men with dusty aprons and loud voices. Her own voice was quiet, her frame slight, and the city's master masons saw her as an oddity, a curious weed in their stony garden. They had just proven it, too. A commission for the new city mausoleum, a project that would have secured her reputation and her livelihood for years, had been snatched away. The council decided her designs were too melancholic. They gave the work to a man whose angels looked more like pouting children than guardians of the eternal. The rejection left her with little money and a wound far deeper than her pride. So when a letter arrived, bearing the wax seal of the Vale estate, a black wolf silhouetted against a dead tree, she had no choice but to accept. The estate was a place of legend, a grim blot of ink on the county map, spoken of in whispers. It was said a perpetual winter clung to its lands, that the lord of the manor had not been seen in public for a generation, and that the silence within its walls was heavy enough to suffocate a bird in mid-flight. The steward, a severe man named Malachi with eyes like chips of flint, had commissioned her for a task no one else would take, the restoration of the ancient family crypts. They were crumbling, he'd written, their inscriptions worn away by a century of unnatural frost. So Elara packed her tools, her thickest woolens, and the quiet resolve that was her only real armor, and took the carriage ride into the heart of the cold. The journey itself felt like a descent. The vibrant greens of the countryside slowly bled out, replaced by muted grays and the stark skeletal white of frost-covered trees. The air grew thin and sharp, biting at her lungs, when the carriage finally rolled to a stop before the iron gates of Vale Manor. She felt she had arrived at the end of the world. The manor was a Gothic masterpiece of sorrow, all sharp angles and shadowed archways, its stone the color of a stormy sky. It loomed over the landscape, not so much built upon it, as having clawed its way out of the earth. Malachi met her at the door, his presence as cold as the marble floor of the great hall. He led her not to the main house, but to a small Spartan cottage on the edge of the sprawling, snow-dusted grounds. "Your work is in the graveyard," he'd said, his voice clipped and devoid of welcome. "You will keep to yourself. Lord Vale values his privacy above all else." And so her days began. Each morning she would walk from her small cottage through a landscape of profound stillness. The snow under her boots never seemed to melt, even when a pale, watery sun appeared in the sky. It was a strange, dry, ancient snow that crunched like powdered bone. The graveyard was a city of the dead, a labyrinth of tilting headstones and grand, sorrowful mausoleums, all draped in white. Her work was slow and methodical. She would clear the snow from a weathered stone, trace the faint, eroded letters with her fingertips, and then, with painstaking care, begin to recut them, giving them back their voice. She worked in silence, the only sounds the rhythmic tap-tap-tap of her mallet against the chisel and the sigh of the wind through the barren yew trees. She felt a strange sense of peace there. These forgotten people, these faded names, they did not judge her. They simply were. In giving them back their memory, she felt she was reclaiming a piece of her own purpose. She was not just Elara, the failed artist. She was Elara, the keeper of names. For weeks, she saw no one but Malachi, who brought her meals on a tray left silently at her cottage door. The lord of the manor remained a phantom, a palpable absence that charged the very air with a sense of being watched. Sometimes, from the corner of her eye, she would catch a flicker of movement in the highest window of the manor, a shadow shifting where no shadow should be. She told herself it was a trick of the light. The cold was her constant companion. It was a deep, penetrating cold that sank into her bones, a cold that felt older and more personal than mere weather. The candles in her cottage seemed to gutter and shrink from it. It was the cold of the grave, and it clung to the entire estate like a shroud. Then came the day she found the tomb. It was set apart from the others, on a small rise overlooking the frozen lake. It was a massive sarcophagus of polished black granite, utterly devoid of inscription. No name, no date, no epitaph. Just a vast, silent block of stone that seemed to absorb the light around it. It was the centerpiece of the entire graveyard, yet it was a perfect void, a monument to nothing. Snow had gathered on its flat lid, a pristine blanket of white. Elara felt an overwhelming wave of pity for whoever lay within, so completely forgotten, so deliberately erased. All these other stones shouted their grief, their love, their loss. This one whispered only of oblivion. She set down her tools. The air was particularly still that afternoon, the silence absolute. On impulse, driven by a loneliness that resonated with the forgotten soul beneath the stone, she reached out. Using her finger, she began to trace a word in the thin layer of snow covering the granite lid. It was a simple, hopeful word, a promise, remembered. She had just finished the last letter, the soft curve of the final D, when a voice spoke from directly behind her. Remembered. The voice was not loud, but it filled the entire world. It was a sound like old velvet and graveyard soil, like smoke and ancient wine. It was impossibly deep and resonant, and it carried the chilling echo of centuries. Elara froze, her heart seizing in her chest. She hadn't heard anyone approach. The snow was unbroken all around her, save for her own footprints. It was impossible. Slowly, she turned. He was standing a mere 2 feet away, a figure of impossible stillness. He was tall and severe, dressed in the dark, immaculate tailoring of a nobleman from another era. His face was a study in aristocratic beauty, all sharp planes and elegant lines, framed by hair as black as a raven's wing. He looked like one of the marble effigies in the crypt, carved by a master's hand. But his eyes were alive. They were the color of deep, polished garnet, and they were fixed on the word she had written in the snow. As she watched, the shadows around his feet seemed to deepen and stir, pooling like spilled ink on the white ground, though the sun was still in the sky. "That is a word this place has not known for a very long time," he said. his gaze lifting from the tomb to finally meet hers. The cold intensified around him, a tangible presence that made her breath mist in the air. Elara found her own voice, a small, trembling thing. "Every soul deserves to be remembered, my lord." She assumed this must be the reclusive Lord Vale. A flicker of something. Surprise? Interest? Passed through those crimson depths. He took a step closer, and the candles she'd set on a nearby stone guttered wildly, as if in a sudden gale. He moved with a liquid grace that was utterly silent. "You are the mason," he stated. It was not a question. "I am, my lord. Elara." "Elara," he repeated, and her name on his tongue sounded both ancient and new. He looked at her hands, which were chapped and dusty with stone. "You have skilled hands. You give voice to the forgotten." "I try," she whispered. He gestured to the great, unmarked tomb. "The steward hired you to repair the crumbling memories of my ancestors. A practical task. But this was not practical. This was an act of compassion." He said the word as if it were a foreign delicacy, something he was tasting for the first time. "It seemed lonely," she said simply, feeling foolish. Lord Vale was silent for a long moment, his stillness so absolute it was unnerving. He was not breathing. She realized it with a jolt of primal fear. He was not breathing at all. He was a statue, a perfect, beautiful, terrifying statue that could move and speak. "Malachi is dismissed from your oversight," he said finally, his tone leaving no room for argument. "From now on you will answer only to me. You will be moved into the manor. There is a project I have for you, a commission far greater than mending these old stones." Before she could respond, Malachi himself appeared, hurrying through the tombstones, his face a mask of panic. "My lord, you should not be out in the daylight. Please return to the house." Lord Vale did not even turn to look at him. His garnet eyes remained locked on Elara. "The mason will be taking the queen's suite in the east wing, Malachi. See to it. And bring her tools to the grand crypt beneath the chapel. Her new work begins tonight." The steward's face went pale with shock, and something that looked like fear. "My lord, that crypt has been sealed for—" "It is unsealed now," the Lord interrupted, his voice dropping an octave, laced with an authority that was as old and unyielding as the mountains. The shadows around his feet writhed. "Do as you are told." Malachi bowed his head, defeated. Lord Vale turned his attention back to Elara. A strange, melancholic smile touched his lips, a fleeting expression that did not reach his eyes. "Welcome to my house, Elara the Mason. It seems you have an affinity for tombs. I have one in particular that requires your attention." And with that, he seemed to simply dissolve into the growing twilight, melting back into the shadows from which he had emerged. Elara was left standing alone in the snow, the single word she had carved already beginning to fade, her heart hammering against her ribs with a mixture of terror and a strange, inexplicable curiosity. She had come to the Vale estate to restore the memories of the dead. She was beginning to suspect she had been summoned to awaken one of them. The manor was a different world from her small cottage. It was a place of cavernous silences and echoing corridors. Malachi, his face tight with disapproval, led her through halls lined with portraits of people with Lord Vale's dark hair and unnervingly intense eyes. Dust motes danced in the thin shafts of moonlight that pierced the grime-covered windows. The air was thick with the scent of beeswax, old paper, and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet, like frost on iron. Her rooms were opulent but funereal. A vast four-poster bed draped in black velvet, a fireplace that had not seen a flame in a century, and windows that looked out over the endless, snow-covered grounds. It was a gilded cage, beautiful and cold. Later that night, as a sliver of moon hung in the sky, Lord Vale came for her. He did not knock. He was simply there, standing by the window, a silhouette against the pale light. "It is time," he said. He led her deep into the manor, down winding staircases that seemed to descend into the very bedrock of the earth. The air grew colder, heavier. They passed through an old chapel, its pews covered in white cloths like sleeping ghosts, and stopped before a massive iron door set into the stone floor. It was bound with chains that looked ancient and heavy. With a gesture of his hand, the chains slithered apart like metallic snakes, and the heavy door groaned open, revealing a set of stone steps leading down into absolute darkness. "Bring your finest chisels," he commanded, his voice a low murmur in the dark. "The stone in here is unforgiving." The grand crypt was a circular chamber of breathtaking scale. Its ceiling soared into darkness, supported by pillars carved to look like weeping angels. In the center of the room, on a raised dais, sat a single, magnificent sarcophagus. It was the twin of the one in the graveyard, carved from the same polished black granite, utterly blank and featureless. Candles in iron sconces flickered to life as they entered, their flames casting long, dancing shadows that clung to their master. The shadows were more than just an absence of light. They moved with a sentience, a purpose, clinging to Lord Vale's coat, pooling at his feet. A loyal, silent pack of hounds. "This is your commission, stone carver," he said, his voice echoing in the vast, cold space. Elara approached the sarcophagus, running a hand over its perfectly smooth, chillingly cold surface. "Whose tomb is it, my lord?" "It is mine." The words fell into the silence, heavy and final. Elara turned to look at him. His face was unreadable in the flickering light, a mask of pale, aristocratic beauty. "But you are," she stammered, unable to finish the sentence. "I am," he agreed, a faint, bitter irony in his tone. "For now, I am a relic, a painting whose colors have faded, a book whose pages have turned to dust. I have existed for more centuries than this country has had a crown. I have watched empires rise and crumble into sand, and I feel nothing." He moved to stand beside her, his presence a vortex of cold that made her shiver. "This body continues, but the soul within it has been frozen for a very long time. I am tired, Elara. I wish for it to end. I wish for the silence of true oblivion." This was his revelation, not a request for a memorial, but for an epitaph. He was commissioning his own gravestone. "Why me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Because of what you did in the snow," he said, his garnet eyes boring into hers. "You looked upon a forgotten thing and offered it remembrance. You did not recoil from the morbid or the sad. You gave it a gift. I want you to give me one last gift." He reached into his coat and produced a small, rolled piece of parchment, yellowed with age. He handed it to her. Her fingers brushed his, and his skin was as cold and smooth as the tomb itself. "This is my true name," he said, "a name that has not been spoken aloud since the age of iron and myth. I want you to carve it into this stone. I want my end to be marked by hands that understand memory. When you are finished, I will lie down in this tomb, and this long, weary existence will finally be over." Elara looked from the ancient parchment to the face of the man, the creature, before her. She saw the profound, crushing weight of ages assas in his eyes. She saw a loneliness so vast it could swallow stars. She did not see a monster. She saw a prisoner. And in that moment, she made a choice, Ton. She would accept his commission. But she would not be the architect of his death. She would be the restorer of his life. "I will do it," she said, her voice clear and steady. "But on one condition." He raised a single, perfect eyebrow. "You would bargain with me?" "I would," she said, meeting his gaze without flinching. "You will tell me the stories. While I carve, you will tell me of the lives you have known. You will tell me of the world you have seen. A name is nothing without the story behind it. If I am to carve your name, I must first understand it." For a heartbeat, the silence in the crypt was absolute. The candle flames froze, the shadows stilled. Lord Vale stared at her, and for the first time she saw a genuine crack in his icy composure. He looked astonished. Then, slowly, a low, rumbling sound emerged from his chest. It was a dry, rusty noise like stones grinding together. It took her a moment to realize he was laughing. It was a laugh devoid of joy, full of a terrible, ancient sorrow, but it was a laugh nonetheless. "Very well, Elara the Mason," he said, the sound fading. "You shall have your stories, but do not think they will change anything. The stone is already cut. You are merely adding the inscription." He was wrong. She knew it with a certainty that defied all logic. The stone was not yet cut, and she, a simple carver of names, was about to take her chisel to the frozen heart of the vampire king himself. Would you have stayed when you learned his true plan was to die? Tell me in the comments, and if you are not subscribed yet, join this family. And so their strange ritual began. Every night, they would descend to the grand crypt. Elara would light the candles, lay out her tools, the heavy mallets, the fine-toothed claws, the delicate chisels for finishing work. The scent of stone dust and cold air would fill the chamber. She began by marking her lines, sketching out the letters of the name on the parchment. It was a complex, beautiful name, full of sharp, angular runes from a language long dead. As she worked, her mallet and chisel singing their steady, rhythmic song, he would speak. At first, his stories were distant and impersonal, historical accounts of battles and coronations he had witnessed. He spoke of Roman legions marching through muddy fields and of Viking longships appearing like dragons out of the sea mist. His voice was a monotone, a recitation of facts. But Elara was patient. She would pause in her work, her hands coated in a fine white powder, and ask questions. "What did the air smell like then?" she'd ask. "After the rain, in that Roman camp?" He would fall silent, a flicker of confusion in his eyes. "It smelled of wet wool, and wood smoke, and fear." The last word came out as a surprise, even to him. Another night, as she carefully carved the curve of a particular rune, she asked, "You mentioned the queen wore a string of pearls. What did her voice sound like?" He seemed to search through a vast, dusty library in his mind. It was like honey, but with a sliver of steel hidden within it. She was more of a king than her husband ever was. Slowly, painstakingly, she was drawing the color back into his faded memories. She was forcing him to remember not just the events, but the feeling of them. She was asking the historian to become a poet. He watched her work with an unnerving intensity. His stillness was absolute, his crimson eyes tracking the fall of her hammer, the spray of stone dust. The shadows in the crypt were his audience, silent and watchful. They would lengthen and shorten with the candle flames, sometimes brushing against the edges of her work table, as if curious to touch her tools. One evening, the cold in the crypt was more biting than usual. Elara's fingers grew numb, and she fumbled, her chisel slipping and scoring a shallow scratch outside the lines she had drawn. She let out a soft cry of frustration. "It is ruined," she whispered, staring at the imperfection. "It is not." His voice came from right beside her. He had moved without a sound. He reached out and traced the scratch with a long, pale finger. "It is a mark of the hand that made it. It proves it was not made by a machine. It proves it was made with passion." He looked at her, and his eyes held a new light, a glimmer of something she couldn't name. "Perfection is a sterile thing, Elara. It is the flaws that give a thing its soul." As the weeks turned into a month, the atmosphere between them began to shift. The space was no longer just a cold tomb. It was their shared world. She learned to read his silences, to see the subtle shifts in his posture that betrayed a thought. He, in turn, began to anticipate her needs, having a cloth ready when her brow was damp with effort, or pointing out a flaw in the stone she hadn't yet seen. He started telling her stories that were more personal. He spoke of his human life, of a family lost to plague, of a love that had ended in betrayal and turned him into the creature he was. He spoke of his early centuries, a whirlwind of rage and power, and of the long, slow decline into apathy, into the frozen stillness she had found him in. "There is a point," he told her one night, his voice low and melancholic, "when you have seen every sunrise, every war, every possible permutation of human hope and folly, it all becomes a repetition. A play you have seen 1,000 times. You forget your lines. You forget why you are on the stage at all." "Perhaps you just need a new story," she replied softly, not looking up from her work. The tapping of her chisel was the only answer for a long time. The first time he touched her was an accident. She was reaching for a finer chisel, and her hand brushed his, which was resting on the edge of the tomb. A jolt went through her, sharp and electric. His skin was impossibly cold, like marble that had been left out in the winter frost. But underneath the cold, there was a thrum of immense, contained power. It was like touching a monolith that hummed with the energy of the earth. He did not pull away. Instead, his long fingers closed gently around hers. He lifted her hand, turning it over, examining the calluses on her palm, the faint scars from a lifetime of working with stone. "Such strong, delicate hands," he murmured, his thumb tracing the lines of her skin. The gesture was so intimate, so unexpected, it stole the breath from her lungs. The cold of his touch was not painful. It was a strange, clean cold that seemed to draw the heat from her, but also the weariness. He held her hand for a long moment, his garnet eyes searching her face. The shadows in the room drew in closer, as if holding their breath. In that instant, the great, powerful vampire king looked vulnerable, lost. Slowly, he brought her hand to his lips. He did not kiss it. He simply held it there, his cool breath ghosting across her knuckles. It was a gesture of immense reverence, of a thirst that had nothing to do with blood and everything to do with a desperate need for connection. "Elara," he breathed her name against her skin, and it was a prayer. He released her hand, and the spell was broken. But something had fundamentally changed. The line between mason and patron, between mortal and immortal, had been irrevocably blurred. The work on the tomb was nearing completion. The ancient name was almost fully realized, a work of breathtaking detail and precision. Elara found herself slowing down, finding small details to perfect, excuses to spend one more night in his company. The thought of finishing, of him fulfilling his promise to himself, was a cold knot of dread in her stomach. She was not just carving his tomb. She was falling in love with the man who had commissioned it. But their quiet, isolated world was not as secure as she believed. Malachi, the steward, had not been idle. He watched from the shadows of the manor, his resentment and fear festering. He was a man from a long line of keepers, a family who had served the Vale lords for centuries. They believed the lord's frozen apathy was a form of control, a stasis that kept the estate's dark power in check. He saw Elara not as a savior, but as a disruption. He saw the faint light returning to his master's eyes, heard the distant echo of a laugh in the halls, and he was terrified. He believed she was waking a sleeping dragon, one that would consume them all in fire and ruin. He decided he had to stop her. His first attempt was subtle. He began leaving tools in her path on the dark stairways, hoping she would trip and fall. He tampered with the ropes on the dumbwaiter that brought her meals, causing the tray to crash to the floor. Elara dismissed them as accidents, her mind too preoccupied with Alaric to see the malice behind them. But Malachi grew bolder. He knew the manor's secrets, its hidden passages and structural weaknesses. One night, as Elara made her way to the crypt alone, he was waiting. He was in the crumbling colonnade that led to the chapel, his face a grim mask in the moonlight. He dislodged a loose keystone high above the walkway. With a groan of ancient mortar, a section of the heavy stone ceiling began to give way, a shower of dust and pebbles preceding the fall of massive blocks. Elara looked up, her eyes widening in terror as the stone plunged towards her. There was no time to run, no time to even scream. But the stones never hit her. In the split second before impact, the shadows in the colonnade exploded into life. They shot up from the ground, no longer formless, but solidifying into whipping, powerful tendrils of absolute darkness. They wrapped around the falling blocks, catching them, holding them, suspended in mid-air with a soundless, terrifying strength. And then Alaric was there. He hadn't run. He had simply appeared between her and the danger, a blur of motion too fast for the human eye to follow. He stood before her, his back to the suspended chaos, and his face was a terrible thing to behold. His aristocratic features were twisted into a snarl of pure predatory rage. His eyes were not garnet anymore. They were blazing coals of crimson fire, burning with an ancient, terrifying light. The cold that radiated from him was no longer just a chill. It was a physical force, a wave of absolute zero that cracked the nearby flagstones and flash froze the moisture in the air. His gaze found Malachi, who was cowering by a pillar, his face ashen with terror. "You!" Alaric snarled, and his voice was not human. It was a guttural sound from the depths of a predator's throat. The shadows that held the stones released them, letting them crash to the ground with a deafening roar. But other shadows, darker and quicker, shot across the floor and wrapped around Malachi, pinning him to the pillar, lifting him from his feet until he was choking, his legs kicking uselessly in the air. Alaric started towards him, every step a promise of annihilation. This was the monster he had kept hidden, the power he had let sleep for a century. the vampire king in his full and terrible glory. But Elara, her heart still pounding with fear, did not run. She stepped forward, out from behind the shield of his body, and placed a hand on his arm. His muscles were like coiled steel beneath the fine wool of his coat. "Alaric," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "Stop." He froze, his head turning slowly to look at her. The rage in his eyes was so potent, it was like looking into the sun. "He tried to harm you, and he failed," she said, her grip on his arm tightening. "Look at him. He is a frightened old man, terrified of change. He is not worth this. He is not worth your darkness." For a long moment, he stared at her, the inferno in his eyes warring with the sound of her voice. The shadows holding Malachi tightened their grip, and the steward let out a choked gasp. "Let him go," Elara said softly. "Do it for me." The battle within him was visible on his face. Then, with an agonizing slowness, the crimson fire in his ivory eyes began to recede, banking back down to a smoldering garnet. The crushing cold lessened. He gave a sharp, almost imperceptible nod. The shadows released Malachi, dropping him to the ground in a heap. He lay there, gasping for air. Alaric turned his back on the steward, his full attention now on Elara. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly, and brushed a stray piece of dust from her cheek. His touch was still cold, but the violent energy was gone. "You are unharmed?" he asked, his voice returning to its familiar low timbre, though it was rough with emotion. "I am," she said, "because of you." She looked at him, at the immense power he had just unleashed and then contained, all for her. And she was not afraid. She had seen the monster, and she had seen the man who held its leash. "Your service to this house is ended," Alaric said, his voice carrying through the ruined colonnade to the cowering man on the floor. "Be gone by sunrise. If you are ever seen on Vale lands again, the shadows will not be so merciful. You are banished." He then turned to Elara, wrapping his arm around her, pulling her away from the destruction and back towards the warmth of the manor. As they walked, she leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling the strange, cold solidity of him. She had seen the worst of him, and she had not turned away. She had stood beside him, and in doing so, she had saved more than one life that night. The next evening, the work on the tomb was finished. The last stroke of the chisel was done. The ancient, runic name gleamed in the candlelight, a masterpiece of form and shadow on the black granite. The silence that fell in the crypt was heavy with unspoken meaning. Elara cleaned her tools slowly, her heart a leaden weight in her chest. It was over. "It is beautiful," Alaric said, his voice soft. He ran his fingers over the name, a gesture of both reverence and farewell. "You have given me a noble end, Elara." "I have given you a name," she corrected him quietly. "What you do with it is your choice." He turned to face her. "The bargain is fulfilled. I will honor my end of it." He meant he would lie down in his beautifully inscribed tomb and welcome oblivion. "No," she said, her voice stronger now. "The bargain is not fulfilled. I asked for your stories. I have listened, and the man in those stories is not a man who is finished. He is a man who is lost. There is a difference." She stepped closer to him, closing the space between them until she had to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. "The world you described, the Roman camps, the Viking ships, the queens with voices of honey and steel, that world is still out there. It has changed, but it is still full of stories. You have not seen them all. You have not seen them with me." His composure finally broke. A look of raw, anguished pain crossed his face. "You do not understand," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I cannot feel it. The sun, the warmth, the joy. It is all a distant memory, a faded painting. I am a ghost in a living world. To stay is only to prolong the torment of emptiness." "Then let me be your warmth," she said, her voice fierce with a love she no longer tried to hide. She reached up and placed her hands on his face, her warm palms against his cold cheeks. "Let me be your reason to feel again. Don't you see, Alaric? When you saved me last night, you felt something. Rage, protectiveness. It was not apathy. You are not as empty as you think." Tears, startling and crystalline, welled in his crimson eyes. They did not fall. They seemed to freeze on his lashes, glittering like tiny diamonds. "Elara," he choked out her name. "The tomb is finished," she said softly. "But it is a monument, not a bed. A monument to the man you were, so that you can be free to become the man you will be. With me." He stared down at her, his ancient soul laid bare in his eyes. He saw no fear in her face, only a fierce, unwavering belief in him. He saw the compassion that had carved a word in the snow, now offering to reshape his entire existence. Slowly, he leaned down and captured her lips with his. The kiss was cold, so cold it was like pressing her mouth to a marble statue in winter. But then a flicker, a spark of impossible heat deep within him, a pilot light that had been dormant for centuries, now fanned into a tiny, miraculous flame by her breath, by her life, by her love. The kiss deepened, and the cold was no longer just cold. It was a torrent of sensation, of feeling, of 1,000 forgotten emotions rushing back at once. When he finally pulled away, his eyes were clear, and the frozen tears on his lashes had melted, tracing paths down his pale cheeks. "The winter is over," he whispered. A week later, Lord Alaric Vale hosted a gathering at the manor, the first in over a century. The invitations sent a shockwave through the local nobility, including the very councilmen who had dismissed Elara's work. Curiosity and a little fear brought them all to the gates of the legendary estate. They found a manor transformed. The dust sheets were gone, the windows were clean, and fires blazed in every hearth. The oppressive cold had lifted, replaced by a welcoming warmth. Lord Vale stood at the top of the grand staircase, a figure of commanding presence. But he was not alone. Elara stood beside him, her simple dress looking more elegant than any of the jewels worn by the other ladies. Her hand was resting in his. He welcomed his guests, his voice smooth and resonant. He spoke of a new era for the Vale estate, a time of re-engagement with the world. Then he introduced Elara. "This is Miss Elara," he announced, his voice ringing with pride. "A master mason whose artistry has not only restored the history of my house, but has restored its future. She is the new mistress of Vale Manor, and my chosen companion." A collective gasp went through the room. The councilmen who had called her work too melancholic stared, their faces a mixture of shock and dawning horror at their misjudgment. Alaric then presented her with a heavy, ribbon-bound deed. "And so that her talents may be shared with the world, I have endowed a new workshop in the city. It is hers, to design and run as she sees fit." In a single evening, in front of the very people who had cast her out, he had given her a home, a title, and the professional recognition she had always deserved. He had seen her, and now the whole world had no choice but to see her too. Later, after the guests had departed, Dizzy with wine and wonder, Alaric led her back to the graveyard. The air was cool but no longer biting. For the first time in 100 years, the snow was beginning to melt. Patches of dark, rich earth were visible beneath the white. They stood before the first tomb, the one where she had carved her word in the snow. "You were right," he said. "A name is nothing without a story." He looked at her, his love for her shining in his eyes. "My story was over, but now it is just beginning. Our story." He gestured to the blank space on the sarcophagus. "It still needs a name. What shall you carve?" She smiled, picking up a small, sharp piece of flint from the ground. She didn't need her tools for this. She reached out and, in her own elegant script, scratched a single name into the granite. Not the ancient runic name from the crypt, not a name from his past. She wrote, Alaric, the name of the man she knew, the name of the man she loved, the name of the man who was standing beside her, ready to live. A year passed. Spring came to the Vale estate, a riot of defiant green and vibrant color. Daffodils bloomed where snow had once lain for a century. The gardens, long dormant, had been brought back to life under Elara's care. They were in the library, a vast room she had filled with new books and comfortable chairs. A fire crackled in the hearth, its warm light dancing on the spines of 1,000 volumes. Elara was curled on a sofa, reading, her head resting on Alaric's shoulder. His skin was still cool to the touch, a permanent part of his nature, but it was no longer the deathly cold of the tomb. It was the cool of evening stone after a warm day. He was still a creature of night and shadow, but his darkness no longer felt like an absence of light. It felt like a deep, comforting quiet. He closed the book he was holding and gently took her hand, tracing the lines on her palm with his finger. "I have been thinking," he said, his voice a low murmur against her hair, "about time. Your time is a beautiful, fleeting river. Mine is a vast, motionless ocean. They are not the same." She knew what he was asking. She had known this conversation would come. The question of her mortality hung between them, a delicate, unspoken thing. She turned her head, pressing a soft kiss to his shoulder. "A life, however short, that is truly lived and truly loved, is an eternity," she said softly. "You have taught me that. You, who had an eternity, but no life." He was silent, his thumb continuing its gentle caress of her skin. "Is it a choice I have?" she asked. "To join you in your ocean?" "It is a choice we will have," he corrected her gently. "When the time is right, when you are ready, if you are ever ready, it will be your decision, Elara, not mine. I would rather have a lifetime with you than an eternity without you. I will not lose you to the ice again." She smiled, a deep, contented smile that reached her eyes. She settled back against him, listening to the crackle of the fire and the steady, silent beating of her own heart next to his still one. The future was a mystery, a story not yet written. But for the first time in either of their long, lonely lives, it was a story they would write together. He lowered his head, his lips finding the pulse point at her throat, and rested there, breathing in her warmth, her life. He was home. For more stories where true compassion conquers the ice of eternal loneliness, and where a quiet strength becomes a world-changing love, subscribe to Herb Files. So tell me, would you have stayed? Comment where you are listening from tonight. I stay up until my eyes burn to bring you these stories. If this one touched you, Do not break my heart. Subscribe and I will see you in the next one.